Peter Dorman here. The topic today is core assumptions in economics. Economics as a discipline differs from other disciplines like sociology or anthropology or political science, not partly in its subject matter, but even more in the assumptions and methods it brings to the subject matter. In this lecture, we'll look at three critical assumptions that economists make that have a profound influence on the way they do their work and the results they come up with. The first is the notion of the economy itself, that it consists more or less entirely of choice and exchange, moments in which people are choosing, moments in which people are making exchanges with each other, and the other aspects of the economy have a tendency to be left out. The second assumption, that all participants in the economy are rationally self-interested. Both of those words, rational and self-interest, have specific meanings that we'll look into. And the third is that the centerpiece of the method is locating an equilibrium. So that involves having a concept of an equilibrium, but also certain assumptions of how an equilibrium operates within a complex system. Of course, there's no way that you can organize systematically a body of thought or an analytical tradition around a subject matter as complex as economics without making lots of assumptions. But the problem is not the assumption itself as much as it is forgetting that you've made the assumption. If you keep them in mind, you know when and how much to trust the conclusions that you come to. So let's look at the first, the notion that an economy is a sphere of choice and exchange. Now, a choice is a decision that's made on an individual level. I would make a choice about something as a single person, a single individual. I would think about a set of options, and in my mind, I might choose one option over the other. Exchange is a collective activity. It's something that people make in conjunction with one another, or organizations make in conjunction with one another. So one party to the exchange makes a choice to offer one thing, and the other party makes a choice to offer something else. They accept each other's offers, and there's an exchange. Both of them have the property that they occur instantaneously and therefore do not have a time element. A choice is considered to happen in an instant, and so also an exchange. The point I want to emphasize here is that choice and exchange are instantaneous mental or activities or decisions. They are not activities in the normal sense as things we do that take place over time. Let's see how this would play out in an actual example. Consider the issue of housing, for instance. Suppose you need a place to live. Well, the first thing you're going to do is go out searching for housing. You might consult Craigslist or a specialized housing service, travel around, look at houses. That could take up a lot of time. Eventually, you find something you like, and you have to negotiate. If there is a negotiation option, you would negotiate a price with either the person who might sell you the house or a landlord who might rent it to you, depending on whether you're buying or renting. The next step is, if the negotiation is successful, you come to an agreement. And that agreement would typically be accompanied by some sort of a contract. And in the contract, it specifies what was being exchanged, so that access to the house or ownership of the house was being exchanged for a sum of money or an agreement, a commitment to pay money over time if it's a rental. Then, once you've got the agreement, you have to actually move in. And that can be quite laborious, depending on how much stuff you have. You have to transport it, you have to set it up. In a sense, that process never ends because you're always second-guessing yourself and rearranging and so on when you live in a house. And then, finally, you live there. You use the house. You maintain the house. You clean the house. You do all these activities. So this is what it means to engage in housing if you are a typical person. That's what it looks like. Now, how does it look in economics? Economists pretty much wipe out from their vision everything but the moment of agreement on a purchase or rental. So they have a transaction, a housing transaction, in which you agree to buy a house or to rent a house at a certain price or certain rental rate, and that's it. The rest of the entire housing activity or set of activities that we would be involved in if we were actually living in a house is outside the purview of economics, for the most part. This is a kind of a simplification, but it's not. It's much more correct than incorrect. So when you think about it, you have to ask yourself, what are economists missing? What is missing from economics? Some people say that the problem with economics is that it's missing the non-monetary parts of the economy. It looks only at the things that are bought and sold for money. So it leaves out household work, it leaves out the environment, and many other aspects of life which are not monetized. But in fact, that statement is not true. Economists study these things routinely and quite intensively. If you look at the economics literature, you will see endless articles where economists are estimating what would be the market value of this particular environmental outcome or that particular bit of housework if it were traded on a market, and how that should affect policy or calculations of economic activity. Economists are quite preoccupied with this sort of thing. What is missing from economics, on the other hand, is a large part, and in many cases almost all, of virtually every activity. That is, economists miss, if you will, the parts of the activity that are not about choice and exchange. On to the second assumption, rational self-interest. Let's begin with an example. Take the case of crime. We're going to ask, why do people commit crimes or not commit crimes, and how do economists typically look at crime? So most people don't commit crimes very often. Some people do, but most don't. And the main reason is cultural or psychological. It has to do with altruism. You might put yourself in the place of the victim of the crime. Conformism, you try to behave the way other people are behaving. You may be concerned about your reputation. Issues of self-esteem come into play, how you look at yourself, if you look in the mirror, what do you see? All of these are reasons why people might not commit crimes. But there's a literature on what's called the economics of crime. And what it studies is a cost-benefit calculation that a potential criminal might go through. So what personal benefits could I get by committing some sort of a crime? What would accrue to me if I get away with it? How likely am I to get caught, and if caught, successfully prosecuted? And if that eventuality occurs, what's going to be the cost for me? What's the cost of punishment? And so with these considerations in mind, potential criminals are thought to go through a cost-benefit calculation, and on the basis of that decide whether to commit a crime or not. Therefore, crime is an outcome of the incentives that criminals or potential criminals face, and these are really nothing other than the rewards and punishments that individuals get for the choices that they make. So let's look at that rational self-interest approach a little bit. It has two components, the self-interest part and the rational part. Self-interest means you're only concerned with consequences for yourself. So you're not concerned with how this affects other people. You're only concerned with your own personal well-being, your comfort, your convenience, your wealth, things that you might acquire even at the expense of other people. Rational. We assume that it's based on a comprehensive and efficient use of information, and that you use that information in a calculating way, in a very sophisticated way, to make the most accurate possible projections of your potential future costs and benefits. And so people are like computers, in a sense, in this way of looking at things. And if you combine self-interest and rationality in this very restrictive and particular sense, you get a sense of what is sometimes called homo economicus, the assumed human being that populates economic models. But of course, on reflection, this is not a very good way to live. The Nobel Prize laureate Amartya Sen referred to this as a recipe for being a rational fool. Another aspect of rationality that's very important to take into account is the distinction between individual and collective rationality. So here is a very historically famous traffic jam. It occurred near Beijing in China about a decade ago. It's the longest traffic jam in history, so it really deserves our respect. It went on for 62 miles and took 12 days before all the traffic was flowing again. I can't even imagine what it might have been like to be in the middle of a jam like that. How does a traffic jam occur? Well, let's think about it. Each person makes an individual choice: when to drive, where to drive, and then they get in their car. And if it happens that lots of people choose to drive in the same direction at the same time, then because of each other's choice and their impact on each individual, you end up with a traffic jam. The traffic jam is not collectively rational. That is, it's not in the rational interest of the people who are caught in the traffic jam. Quite the contrary. It results from their individual rationality. Each person made an individual choice about driving, and it made sense to them. The problem is when you put all those individual choices together, they work against the interests of the people who take part in them. And we know clearly that people could have done better if they had made a collective, coordinated choice about travel. So for instance, they could have coordinated their driving times so that people were starting 15 minutes later than, you would have one group in 15 minutes, another group in a half hour, and so on. You could stagger the travel. You could also provide more mass transit and allow people some alternative to getting into a car. If people had those collective options and if they could use them, they might be individually better off than they would be if they each make a separate individual decision. So this example demonstrates the relationship between individual and collective rationality. Individual rationality takes as given what other people are doing and asks, what's the best thing for you given what other people are doing? Collective rationality takes everybody into account simultaneously and asks, what's best for us if we can decide together? The most famous example of a collective action problem, a situation where collective and individual rationality diverge, is the prisoner's dilemma, which is discussed in some detail in the book. It's a model that anyone in the social sciences should be familiar with. Finally, we'll consider the question of equilibrium. Equilibrium as a central tool in economics deserves some scrutiny for what the term means and how it's supposed to operate. It should be stressed that in economics, equilibrium has no normative significance. Now, this differs from the way the word is used in everyday speech. Typically, when we talk about things being in equilibrium, we mean it's good in some way. It's balanced. It's the way it should be. In economics, there's no such assumption. It might be the case that an equilibrium is a good place to be, but it might not. So in economics and in other areas of the social sciences, an equilibrium is a situation with two critical characteristics. The first is that if you're at an equilibrium, there is no internal force that pushes you towards a change. You might change, the situation might change, but it would change only as a result from something impacting it from the outside. There's no inner tendency to change in equilibrium. If the social situation is in equilibrium, each individual is making the rational choice that they would choose individually to make, given what other people are doing. Nobody would alter their behavior individually in an equilibrium. The second and critical aspect of an equilibrium, one that we'll talk about at some length in future lectures, is that if you're not in an equilibrium, there's a tendency of, within the structure of the situation, to pull you back towards an equilibrium. So for instance, in a market equilibrium, which you've already studied, if you have a surplus of goods, there's a tendency if equilibrium is operating for the price of those goods to go down, and that should, over time, reduce that surplus. And similarly, if there's a shortage of goods, the price goes up, and that has a tendency to reduce that shortage. So in either case, if you're out of equilibrium, there are forces in the situation that push you back in the direction of the equilibrium. Another example is an arms race. Suppose you have countries that are all competing with each other to produce more weapons and fancier weapons because they're afraid of each other. Well, that can be an equilibrium as well, because an individual, first of all, if all the countries are doing it, there's no inner force that would lead to any particular country to say, hey, why don't we just drop out of the arms race? They're afraid that if they drop out, some other country or countries will take them over. Similarly, if you're out of equilibrium, if you have a situation where some countries are developing their weapons and not others, the countries that are not developing will look around and say, oh dear, we're at risk of being taken over. We have to develop our weapons. And so the situation slides back into an arms race. Now, that's a stylized representation. Of course, there could be other exceptions or different historical paths to it, but this is a simplified model that might be used of why an arms race would occur and why it might even be an equilibrium, although a terrible equilibrium for the countries involved. An arms race is one example of a prisoner's dilemma. Equilibrium is a very useful concept in social science. It's definitely useful for prediction because if you're out of equilibrium, the theory of equilibrium gives you a method for predicting how the system will adapt so as to move towards an equilibrium. And if the theory is correct, that gives you some predictive power. It's useful to have predictive power. Similarly, if you're proposing a change from the outside, some external event that might happen, which would change that social situation, like a market or something like this, equilibrium is also a useful concept because you could, on the basis of this change, estimate or calculate what you think the new equilibrium is likely to be. And even if the situation doesn't go there immediately, you have a reason to think it might end up there eventually. It also has a practical advantage, that is, a situation that's in equilibrium has a certain benefit attached to it, which is that it's relatively stable. After all, equilibrium is a situation in which there's not an inner tendency to change, and if anything it interrupts that equilibrium and causes it to break down temporarily, there will be a tendency for the system to reconverge back to its original equilibrium state. And stability could be a good thing, but it also could be a bad thing, and all of that depends.